Welcome to the channel where legends sleep. Tonight's story takes us to the frozen edge of the Norse world, where the wind speaks in riddles and the horizon dissolves into something older than memory. From the ice-carved sagas of the ancient Norse, there comes a tale of thunder and trickery, of a god who believed his strength was absolute, and a kingdom that would make him doubt everything his hands had ever held. Thor the mighty, the Stormbringer, will cross into Utgard, a realm where nothing is what it appears, where giants do not conquer with force, but with something far more unsettling: illusion. What awaits him there will shake the very foundations of what a god believes himself to be. And perhaps, in the quiet of tonight, it will make you wonder too, how much of what we see is real, and how much is merely the shape of a dream. So lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. There is a particular kind of restlessness that visits even gods. It comes on autumn mornings when the light turns the color of old honey and the wind carries the faint, cold edge of what is coming. It settles behind the eyes and hums low in the chest, and no amount of mead or warmth or company quite reaches it. You know the feeling. So did Thor. He had been standing at the edge of Asgard since before the other gods had finished their breakfast, Mjolnir hanging at his hip, his red cloak already gathered at the shoulder. He was watching the world below. The vast Norse wilderness with its dark pine forests and its silver rivers and its hills fading one behind the other into a blue distance that had no clear ending. He was not thinking about anything in particular. That was the point. Loki appeared beside him the way Loki always appeared beside things, as if he had simply always been there and you had only just noticed. He was dressed for travel, lean and easy in his movements, his green eyes carrying that particular expression he wore when he already knew something you did not. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said cheerfully, "You are going to go down there whether I come or not." Thor considered this. "Yes," he agreed. "Then I am coming," said Loki, and that settled it. They crossed the bridge as the morning was still young and cold, the great arc of it humming faintly underfoot. And then they were among the mountains, and then among the trees, and Asgard was somewhere behind them in the brightness, and neither of them looked back. That is the first rule of any good journey. You do not look back at the beginning of it. The Norse world received them without ceremony. It was not a soft place. The forests here were old and dense, the trees enormous, their roots shouldering up through the earth like the knuckles of something buried long ago. The path wound between them without much confidence, narrowing and widening as it pleased, crossing cold streams on stepping stones that were just slightly too far apart. The sky, where it showed between the canopy, was the deep, particular blue of autumn, not summer's blue, which is wide and easy, but autumn's blue, which is bright and a little mournful. like something beautiful that already knows it is ending. Loki walked ahead for a while, then fell behind, then appeared at Thor's elbow again, as if he had not moved. He had opinions about the path. He had opinions about everything. He suggested, at various points, 3 different directions as being the more interesting one. Thor followed none of them, walking straight forward with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who had never been much troubled by doubt. This was, depending on the situation, either his greatest strength or a source of considerable problems. Loki had long since made peace with both possibilities. By late afternoon, the forest had changed around them. The pines gave way to birch and rowan, and the light coming through the turning leaves was gold and amber and a deep, slow red, painting everything in colors that seemed lit from within rather than from above. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the particular sharpness of cold water nearby. Somewhere high above them, unseen, 2 ravens called back and forth, their voices echoing between the hills. Thor paused and listened to the ravens. He always did. Not far from there, a river ran over pale stones in the hollow between 2 hills, quick and clean, not wide enough to be a problem. They stopped to drink. The water was so cold it made the bones of Thor's hands ache pleasantly, and he stayed crouched at the bank for a moment longer than necessary, watching the current slip over the rocks, rearranging the light into small, quick shapes that vanished before you could properly look at them. "Where are we going?" Loki asked, sitting on a flat stone and doing absolutely nothing useful. "East," said Thor. "East is quite large." "Good," said Thor. Loki looked at him for a moment, then laughed. A short, genuine sound that he didn't produce very often, and lay back on the stone and looked up at the sky through the leaves. The gold light moved across his face. He seemed, for once, entirely content. They made camp when the light finally gave out, which it did slowly and beautifully, the sky going from amber to rose to a deep bruised purple before releasing the stars. They had no particular skill at making comfortable camps, being gods who slept in halls, but they managed a fire and they managed to be warm, and the fire was good. It threw orange light against the trunks of the nearest trees and made the darkness beyond it seem friendly rather than otherwise, the way a fire always does if you let it. Thor sat with his back against a birch and cleaned his hands absently with a handful of dry leaves. Loki was across the fire doing something with a twig that he would claim was important if asked. The forest was quiet around them, the way deep forest is quiet, not empty, but resting, full of small sounds that were not alarming, only present. Somewhere out in the dark, further east, the land was still going. It went on for a long time, and they had not reached the edge of it yet. They would, though. That was the agreement, unspoken but understood between them. They would keep going until something interesting happened. In the east, something was already waiting. Content. It found them before they found it. They had been walking for perhaps an hour into the following morning. the forest still dark, the path narrowing between stands of pine, when the shape of a building appeared through the trees. Or what seemed like a building, it had the proportions of a hall, long, low-roofed, with a wide entrance at one end large enough to drive a cart through. The walls were dark wood, or something like wood. The floor inside was flat and dry. There was no fire, no furniture, no sign of whoever had built it, but there was shelter, and that was enough. Loki ducked inside first, as he usually did, testing the air the way a cat tests a room. He walked its length, knocked lightly on one wall, shrugged. Thor followed with the others, the Yalfi and Roskva, the two young mortals who had joined them on the road the evening before. And they settled toward the far end, where a kind of alcove branched off to the side, narrower but enclosed. They spread their cloaks. They slept, except that sleeping was harder than it should have been. Somewhere in the night, the ground trembled. Not violently, not the sharp lurch of something breaking, but a long, low shuddering, like a hill deciding to stretch. It came and went, came again. Jalfi pressed himself flat against the far wall of the alcove and said nothing, which was the wisest response available. Thor sat up twice with his hand on the handle of his hammer, scanning the dark length of the hall and finding nothing there. Loki, to everyone's quiet irritation, appeared to sleep through all of it. By the time gray light started at the entrance, they were not exactly rested, but they were alive, which is sometimes the more important category. Thor was first outside. The forest around them was the same forest it had been. Birch and pine, frost on the moss. The first birds starting somewhere overhead. Ordinary enough. But a short distance away, on a broad patch of open ground between the trees, something very large was lying down. It was a man, or it had the shape of one. He was lying on his back with his arms at his sides, and the sound he made, slow and rhythmic as a millstone turning, was the sound that had shaken the ground all night. Each breath moved the nearest pines. His boots, pointing at the sky, were roughly the size of small boats. His beard was the color of old iron, thick enough to nest in. Thor stood looking at him for a moment. Then he looked at the man's hand, resting open on the ground, the broad palm, the curled fingers, and the thumb, which extended off to one side, hollow at the base, just wide enough for 4 travelers to spread their cloaks in the dry dark and sleep. He stood with this information for a little while. Loki emerged from the entrance, from the thumb, and stopped beside him. He looked at the giant. He looked at Thor. A small, careful smile crossed his face, the kind he used when he had thoughts he considered worth keeping to himself for the moment. And as the light grew, the giant stirred. It happened the way mornings always happen, slowly, and then all at once. One enormous hand moved. Then the broad chest rose on a deeper breath, and 2 pale eyes opened and found the sky, and then, after a moment, found Thor. He sat up. The pines around him shivered. He said. His voice was not loud so much as it was low, a sound that lived in the chest before it reached the mouth. He looked at Thor with what seemed like mild curiosity, the way a man might look at a beetle on his windowsill, not hostile, not impressed, just noticing. Skrymir, he said, which took Thor a moment to understand was the giant's name, offered without ceremony. He reached out and picked up his pack from the ground beside him, a sack the size of a small house, and slung it over one shoulder as he rose to his feet. He rose for quite a long time. When he was fully standing, the light changed around him. Not darkened, it was not dramatic, but the sky above simply had less room in it than it had before. Skrymir looked east. Then he looked down at Thor again, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but less like a beetle and more like a traveler. You're going east, he said. It was not a question. Thor said that they were. Skrymir nodded, slow as a drawbridge lowering. He suggested, without particular enthusiasm, that they might walk together, since they were headed the same way. He could carry their provisions in his pack, that great cloth mountain, which would spare them the weight. Thor agreed, because the logic was sound, and because there is a certain kind of offer that is easier to accept than to refuse when the person making it is tall enough to rest their chin on a rooftop. So it was that they walked with Skrymir through the widening morning, through forest that thinned gradually into something colder and more open, the trees spacing out, the sky growing pale and large overhead. Skrymir walked ahead, and his stride covered ground at a rate that kept the rest of them moving faster than was comfortable. He did not talk much. He pointed out, once, a frozen stream that was good to drink from. Otherwise he simply walked, and the land moved under him like water under a boat. By late afternoon he stopped, set down his pack, and told them he was going to sleep. He was asleep before they had finished gathering wood for a fire. The snoring began again, that deep, earth-bound rumble, and the small flames they'd managed to coax from damp pine needles looked beside him very small indeed. They ate. They spoke quietly. Sjalfi stared at the vast, dark shape of Skrymir and asked in a careful voice how far they still had to go. Nobody knew for certain, but the cold had sharpened, and the stars, when they appeared, were different stars, further north, further east, belonging to a part of the sky that felt less like home than the ones they were used to. Something was ahead. Something with walls. They could not yet see it, but they would. They smelled it before they saw it. Cedar smoke, thick and mineral cold, drifting through the pines like a rumor. Then the trees thinned, and there it was, Utgard, No single word does the thing justice, so the mind reaches for numbers instead. The walls rose so high that the uppermost stones were lost in low cloud, gray and absolute, as though the fortress had simply decided to continue into the sky, and the sky had not objected. The gates were shut, each bar as thick as a long ship's mast, fitted together with an artisan's precision that somehow made the whole structure more unsettling, not less. Whoever built this had cared about the work. That was the part that made Loki go quiet for a moment, which was itself a rare thing. Thor stood at the threshold and considered his options. The gates would not move, not for a shoulder, not for both shoulders, not for the kind of sustained effort that would have leveled a hill in any reasonable part of the world. So he did what you do when a door refuses to cooperate. He found the gap between the bars and squeezed through it. Loki followed. Thialfi, the young farmhand who had joined them the night before, followed after that, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had decided not to think too hard about where he was. Inside, the scale worsened. The hall beyond the courtyard was lit by fires burning in trenches along the floor, each one long enough to roast an ox, and several, in fact, contained something very like that. Giants sat at benches that ran the length of the room, and each giant was large enough that Thor, who was not a small god by any reckoning, felt the unfamiliar sensation of looking up at the people around him. They were not looking back, not yet. The conversations in the hall were low and rumbling, the sound of boulders shifting in deep water. At the far end, elevated by several wide steps, sat Utgard Loki. The king of this place had a face that had seen a great many things, and found most of them mildly entertaining. He was not the largest giant in the room. He didn't need to be. He watched Thor's company walk the length of the hall, with the particular expression of a man who has been expecting a visitor and has already planned the afternoon. When they reached the steps, he let the silence run a few seconds longer than was strictly polite before he spoke. "Guests," he said, "small ones." The hall did not exactly laugh, but something shifted through it, a low vibration and amusement shared between the benches. Thor kept his face still. Utgard Loki tilted his head. "I have heard of you," he said to Thor. "I expected something more. Still, you are welcome in Utgard on one condition. No one sits at my table who cannot prove themselves the finest in the world at something." "What is it you do?" Loki stepped forward before Thor could answer. He was, as always, faster to a stage. "I can eat," Loki said, "faster than any living thing." A giant named Logi was brought forward long and thin as famine, with pale eyes and a stillness that should have been a warning. A trough of meat was placed between them, one at each end, and they ate toward the middle. Loki moved with real purpose, great tearing mouthfuls, a speed that would have cleared any table in the 9 worlds. He reached the center and sat back, jaw aching, satisfied. Logi had eaten his half of the meat, the bones, and the trough itself down to splinters. Loki looked at what remained of his opponent's side for a moment, then looked away. Thialfi, who wanted nothing more than to be useful, offered that he could outrun any challenger. He was fast, genuinely, remarkably fast, the kind of runner who moves like he is falling forward and catching himself just in time. A young giant called Hugi lined up beside him on a long, flat stretch of ground in the courtyard. And they ran, 3 times they ran. The first race, Hugi crossed the end marker while Thialfi was still close enough that it was almost respectable. The second time, the gap was wider, a bow shot between them when Hugi turned around to watch Thialfi arrive. The third time, Hugi reached the end, jogged back to the halfway point, and was walking back again before Thialfi broke through. The young man bent over with his hands on his knees and breathed and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Then it was Thor's turn. Utgard Loki's suggestion was drinking. A horn was brought out, long, curved, darkened at the tip, and set before Thor with something like ceremony. "Most of my men," said the king pleasantly, "can empty that in 1 draught. Some need 2. A very few have required 3. It would be a shame to do worse than 3. Thor lifted the horn. It was full of something that tasted like cold seawater at the edges and darkness further down. He drank until his lungs protested and set it down. The horn was still almost full. He drank again, longer this time, his face going red with the effort, the silence of the hall pressing down like a hand on his shoulder. He set it down again. The level had fallen. Enough to notice, not enough to matter. The third time, Thor drank until the world went gray at the edges of his vision, and the sound in the hall seemed to come from very far away. He set the horn on the bench and stared into it. There was less in it now. There was still a great deal in it. The giants watched him the way you watch someone do something that deserves respect while refusing to show them any. Utgard Loki smiled, he suggested, with every appearance of generosity, that perhaps Thor might prefer a simpler challenge. Lifting a cat. "Just a cat," the king said, gesturing to the large gray animal that had appeared somehow on the floor near Thor's feet. "My men use it as a test of strength for the very young." Thor set his feet, reached down and pulled. The cat arched slowly. One paw lifted from the stone floor hung there, then settled back. Thor pulled harder, his arms trembling, and for one extraordinary moment, only one paw remained on the ground. Then the cat lowered itself again and began to wash its face with complete indifference. Somewhere in the hall, a giant coughed. So, wrestling. Utgard Loki offered this as a consolation, with the cheerful manner of a man who had stopped trying to conceal his entertainment. The opponent brought forward was an old woman. Ellie, the king called her. Lean, gray-haired, with hands that looked like they had spent 1,000 years doing something practical. She moved with deliberate slowness toward Thor, and there was a quiet wrongness to her the way there had been a quiet wrongness to the glove they'd slept in. Something familiar, in the wrong shape. Thor wrestled Ellie for a long time. He pushed and she absorbed it. He shifted and she adjusted. She had no urgency, no aggression, no fear. Just a patient, settling pressure that reminded him of the feeling of standing in deep water as the tide decides to go somewhere else. Gradually, with a steadiness that could not be argued with, one of Thor's knees met the floor. Ellie stepped back. She was not even breathing hard. The hall was not silent. The hall was tactfully looking elsewhere, attending to its food and its fires, granting the god of thunder the small mercy of not being watched too closely at this particular moment. Utgard Loki spread his hands. "Enough," he said. Thor had done well enough, better perhaps, than the modest results suggested. There were places at the table, real places, not the cold end by the door, and food, and the fire was warm, and the night outside was long and hard. Thor sat. He ate. The warmth was real, even if nothing else in Utgard had been quite what it appeared. As the night deepened and the fires burned lower in their trenches, he turned the day over in his mind, the way you turn a stone that doesn't sit flat, suspecting that what matters is on the underside, not yet visible, not yet understood. The contests had been real. The defeats had been real. The shame sitting somewhere behind his ribs was certainly real. But Utgard Loki watched him from the far end of the hall with that same expression, measuring, almost careful. And Thor had the distinct and wordless sense that the story was not finished, not even close. Content. Morning came to Utgard the way mornings rarely do, without birdsong, without the slow blush of color along a horizon. Light simply arrived, flat and total, as though the sun had decided not to bother with ceremony in a place this large. Thor stood at the great gates, with Loki at his shoulder and the others behind him, their packs gathered, their silence mutual and unspoken. No one had said much over breakfast. Even Loki, who could find something to say about almost anything, had spent the meal studying his hands. The gates themselves were already open. Utgard Loki stood between them. Ni was smiling. Not the mocking smile of the night before, the one he had worn like a garment chosen to unsettle. This was something quieter, something that reached his eyes. Thor met his gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. He had learned over a long and humbling night that in this place it was wiser to wait. So he waited. Before you go, Utgard Loki said, and his voice had dropped from the enormous register he had used in the hall. It was almost conversational now, almost warm. There are things I would tell you, things you have earned the right to hear. Thor's jaw tightened, just slightly. Earned. There was an edge to that word, but he let it pass. Everything you saw in my hall, the giant king said, was not what it was. A long pause. The cold air moved between them. Logi, who ate against your man Loki. He was not a man. He was fire itself, wildfire, the kind that does not stop until there is nothing left to consume. Loki lost to the one opponent in all the worlds that has never, not once, left food on the table. Loki made a small sound. It was hard to read. Hugi, who outran your young companion in the foot race. Utgard Loki turned his gaze briefly toward the boy, who had gone very still. Hugi was thought, my own thought, to race thought and still close the distance he closed. That has not happened before, not in any contest I have seen or heard of. The boy blinked. He looked as though he was deciding whether to feel better or simply more confused. Both, Thor suspected, was the honest answer. And the drinking horn, Utgard Loki continued, and here his voice took on a note that was almost, not quite, but almost, reverent. The horn's far end rested in the ocean, the sea that runs between all things. You drank from it, Thor. You drank deeply enough that the tides will run lower for a season, and fishermen and boats will wonder at the strange shallow waters and have no name for what caused them. Thor looked at his hands. He thought of the 3 long pulls he had taken, each one feeling like failure, each one enormous, and still not enough. The ocean. He had been drinking the ocean and cursing himself for his weakness. Something shifted inside his chest. Not pride. Not yet. Something quieter than pride and more durable. The cat, Utgard Loki said, and now he spoke carefully, the way a person speaks when they want each word to land exactly where they intend, was not a cat. It was the Midgard serpent, the great serpent that encircles the world, tail in its own teeth, holding the edges of everything together. When you lifted it, when you raised one paw clear of the ground, the earth shook. My hall shook. I felt it in my feet, and I knew in that moment that I had made a terrible miscalculation in letting you try. Nobody spoke. The wind moved through the gate. And Ellie, Utgard Loki said. He smiled again, slower this time. You wrestled Ellie for longer than any creature living has managed. Ellie is old age. She takes everyone. Thor, eventually, always. She takes everyone. The fact that she had to work for it. He paused, and there was something genuine in his expression, something that sat between wonder and wariness. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the furthest thing from nothing. Thor stood very still. He was not a man given to stillness. He was made for motion, for weather, for the particular satisfaction of a problem solved with both hands. But he stood still now, and let the shape of the night rearrange itself behind his eyes. Every defeat had been real. The shame had been real. But the measuring stick had been bent from the beginning, and he had not known, and he had pushed against it anyway with everything he had. There was something almost funny about that. Deeply, quietly, ruefully funny. He almost smiled. Why? Loki asked. He was looking at Utgard Loki with an expression that was sharper than his voice. Why show us this now? Why tell us at all? The giant king considered the question with what seemed like genuine respect. Because you are leaving, he said simply. You will not return. I will see to that. The gates will not open for you again, because if you came back knowing what I have told you, I do not think my hall would survive the visit. He said this without apology, almost matter-of-factly. But I would not have you walk away believing the story you think you lived. You came to the edges of impossible, Thor Odinson. You and your companions. That deserves to be spoken aloud, at least once before you go. Thor looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, slow. It was not forgiveness. The trick still sat in him somewhere, a small coal of indignation that would probably never fully cool. But it was acknowledgement, one warrior to another, across a distance that could not be measured in steps. Then he turned and walked through the gates. Then the others followed. Behind them, without drama, without sound, the great gates of Utgard swung shut. When Thor looked back, and he did look back just once, the fortress was already smaller than it should have been, already losing itself against the pale sky, already becoming the kind of thing a person might later doubt they had seen. But the tide, somewhere far off, was running low. That much was real. They walked in silence for a long while after that. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence, not the silence of people who have nothing to say to one another, but the kind that settles over travelers at the end of a long day, when the body is weary and the mind has simply run out of the energy required to pretend otherwise. Loki moved beside Thor with his hands tucked somewhere in his cloak, his expression unreadable, though there was something quieter in him than usual. Something almost like peace. The Alfie walked a little behind them both, his remarkable feet carrying him forward at the same unhurried pace as the other two for once, because there was nowhere left to race to. The land received them without ceremony. The pine forests of Midgard closed around the road like a slow exhale, and the pale afternoon light began its gentle withdrawal from the sky, leaving the world cooler, softer, a little less defined at its edges. Thor still felt the memory of Utgard in his shoulders. Not pain exactly, more the echo of effort, the deep resonance of having strained against something immovable and not broken. He had lifted the paw of the Midgard serpent, dressed up as a gray cat on a stone floor. He had wrestled old age itself to one knee. He had drunk 3 long swallows from the ocean. None of these things were supposed to be possible. Utgard Loki had said so at the gate, and his voice had carried the particular weight of someone telling the truth for the first time in days. The thought did not make Thor feel triumphant. Exactly. It made him feel something slower and stranger than triumph. Humble was perhaps too small a word. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a very wide river and understanding, for the first time, just how wide rivers could be. As the night deepened, the stars came out above the pines one by one, as if someone were lighting them deliberately, with care. The road beneath their feet softened from packed earth to something that whispered with fallen needles and dry leaves, and the sound of their walking became almost nothing at all. Loki eventually spoke. He did not announce that he was about to speak. He simply said quietly into the dark between the trees, "He was afraid of you, you know." Utgard Loki, Loki continued in the same unhurried tone. All that mocking hospitality, all those careful illusions. You do not build those defenses for someone you are not afraid of. Thor considered this. The trees moved in a low wind, their branches shifting with a sound like slow breathing. "That is a generous way to look at it," he said at last. "It is an accurate way to look at it," Loki replied. "I would know." Thialfi made a small sound somewhere behind them that might have been a laugh, very carefully contained. And so it was that they walked on, the three of them, through the long quiet of the Norse night. The forest thinned gradually, giving way to open moorland where the stars spread themselves across the sky with no canopy to interrupt them, countless, cold, marvelously indifferent to the small figures moving below. Thor looked up once and held the view for several steps, not thinking anything in particular, just looking. There was something restful in that vastness, something that made the contests at Utgard, the humiliations and the revelations both, feel proportionate, small in the best way. Even gods were small, measured against a sky like that. Not far from there they made camp beside a stream whose voice was low and steady over its stones, a murmur that seemed to have been going on since long before any of them were born, and would continue long after. Thialfi gathered wood and coaxed a small fire into being, and the three of them settled around it without discussion, as people do when they have traveled long enough together that the small arrangements of rest no longer need to be negotiated. The fire was warm. The stream went on talking softly to itself. Above them the stars wheeled in their slow, unhurried arcs across the dark. Thor sat with his forearms resting on his knees and felt the road leave his legs by degrees. He thought, without urgency, about what he would carry home from this. Not the victories. There had been no clean victories. Not the defeats. Those had turned out to be something else entirely. What he would carry was harder to name. The knowledge that the world was larger than he had mapped it, that old age could be wrestled, even if not beaten. That thought itself moved faster than the fastest runner, and that the ocean was only finite if you never looked at it too closely. These were not comfortable things to know. But they were the kinds of things that quietly changed the shape of a person. The fire settled. Thialfi was already asleep, one arm tucked beneath his head, breathing with the slow ease of someone who had genuinely earned the rest. Loki sat a little apart, his sharp face softened by the firelight, watching something in the middle distance that only he could see. Thor lay back against the cool ground and looked up at the stars. Asgard would be there in the morning. The long road would shorten with each step, but for now there was only this: the dark, the warmth of the small fire, the stream moving softly over its stones, and the whole wide night settling around three travelers like a blanket drawn gently over sleeping shoulders. Rest now. The road can wait. The stars are keeping watch.